Fog pressed its slow hand against the tall windows of the Grosvenor Square townhouse, blurring the city into a pale, obedient dream, while violins wavered from the music room and lamplight made trembling gold upon every lifted crystal. The air smelled of wax and wetted wool, of perfume attempting to out-argue November, and within that glow Julian Harrow stood with his back to the marble mantel, an austere air with a cracked pocket-watch tucked like a small chastisement into his waistcoat, watching Evangeline march across the crowded soirée, as if the distance between them were a glass he could fog with a single breath. She was not handsome by the rules his mother kept, but arresting by those the weather obeyed, alert, alive, pearl-grey gloves, tapping a folded program in a soft metronome that ordered the moment around her. She spoke with fervor to a ring of patrons whose medals and pensions had made them sleepy, and he heard only fragments carried through the conversational drift, the children, books, chimneys, each word striking his ribs with the tact of a knuckle at a locked door, disturbing an old residue of smoke he pretended did not cling. He had come because one attends these evenings as one attends to ledgers, because the city kept a tally of absence. Yet now he found himself attentive against his better calculations, his gaze returning and returning, as if it had been trained by something older than his father's habits, when the hostess, glittering and kind, led him through the throng and said, delighted, Mr. Harrow, Miss March. The air tightened, and the politeness between them drew taut as wire. Miss March, he said, inclining his head with perfect economy. Mr. Harrow, she returned, her voice low, even, the faintest iron beneath courtesy, her gloves stilled, and in that small cessation he felt a challenge sharpen. I am told you find figures eloquent, she added, not unkindly. Numbers speak when we remove affectation, he replied, surprised to hear that it sounded like defense. Her eyes lifted, grey as the fog outside, yet warmer. Hunger is not an affectation, she said, and smiled so that he could not accuse her of impropriety, only of accuracy. A weathered benefactor, brown as a field after harvest and twice as wrinkled, drifted between them with a benevolent cough. You two are to make a trifling sport of my poor bequest, he chuckled. The foundling home contested by zeal and by ledgers. You'll argue before the committee at week's end. A charitable arrangement. What? Someone behind them laughed, the kind of laugh that gilded cruelty with conviviality. In the pause that followed, their thoughts moved like chess pieces lifted in bare hands. I will not be bested in my father's city, Julian told himself, feeling the weight of the watch as if it were a commandment. I will not let charity be tamed by a Harrow's ledger, Eva promised within, remembering small faces blurred by coal dust he could call an abstraction. Midnight chimed first from the tall clock in the hall, then faintly from without as churches shook time free of their stones, and the fog thickened, so it seemed the windows themselves might shiver. He glanced down through habit at his pocket watch, its glass starred, and the second hand halted at 9:17, since the factory fire. A private hour he wore like penance, then raised his gaze to her again, puzzled to discover that her voice, when it reached him over the violins, unsettled him not like thunder but like rain inside a house, intimate, uninvited, and impossible to ignore. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. Days later, in a room panelled like a politely kept secret and scented with varnish and the aftertaste of old cigar smoke, rain drizzled against the tall panes with patient insistence, as if the weather had petitioned the committee as well. Chairs creaked when men shifted their weight, ink shone in small obedient lakes on blotters, and Evangeline March stood at the long table with her papers arranged as if they were a modest altar, her voice measured but bright with restrained feeling as she set forth her plan for books, for milk, for mended boots, details so exact they felt like stitches, to teach patience to hungry days, she said without flourish, and the phrase hung a moment like a lantern in the grey. Julian Harrow, austere as a ledger written in an even hand, answered with figures and endowments, and the clean geometry of scale, how many blankets per pound if procurement were centralized, how many loaves if distribution avoided redundancy, how a fund, once consolidated, could generate interest that would keep the doors open past winter. His tone was polished into a restraint that passed, into most ears for certainty, Yet his gaze kept straying to the small swallow embroidered upon her handkerchief, a scrap of flight tamed by thread. He wondered why that swallow troubled him, if it was because it suggested return, or because some part of him had not ceased being soot and wanted, impertinently, to be air. The dialogue, which had begun with civility and careful adjectives, sharpened into honesty. "Sir, poverty is not a miscalculation," she said, the soft conviction of it doing more than any volume could. He felt the old instruction rise in his mouth like a tutor's cane, and let it out calm. "Miss March, benevolence without structure becomes sentiment." A faint murmur answered genteel discomfort, the sound society made when usefulness wore a woman's dress and spoke as if it had been given leave. The chairman coughed into his fist as if extinguishing a candle. Someone's signet ring clicked against the table. She spoke of boots not as inventory but as the difference between a child arriving at a lesson or arriving at a fever. He replied that a system that could not be counted could not be kept. He heard himself and did not entirely like the man he resembled. She heard him and did not entirely dislike the discipline she had sworn to resist. At length, the vote that should have fallen like an axe was postponed. The blade returned to its sheath with murmured phrases: "Spirited divergence, prudent delay, a further inspection is warranted," and the decision came that both petitioners would be appointed to co-steward the bequest, while visiting the home and submitting a joint report. The word "together" slid around the room with a decorum that did not mask its mischief. Outside, the weather refused to brighten. The rain had settled in as if for the season. Weeks would pass under this same stubborn veil, and on the steps he lifted his umbrella in silent offering, while hats lowered and carriages threw up spray. They stood close because the rain required it, their shoulders globed by black silk, her perfume a practical soap, his cologne a memory. They exchanged stiff bows, protocols built for distance, attempted under intimate weather, and when they turned to separate, her gloved hand brushed his sleeve, a friction so slight it might have been the starting of a charge or the warning before one, and something in him acknowledged it like a bell, not loud, but true. He watched her go and felt the cracked watch in his waistcoat grow heavier, as if time had taken on iron. Beneath the rain's whisper he heard again his father's voice, or memory damp with smoke and commandment. "Do not blink in a negotiation. Blinking concedes the world." And he stood there with water sliding off the umbrella's rim and wondered, for the first time, whether there were worlds one ought to concede that better ones might be built. The carriage jolted as if the road had taken offense at its own stones, wheels striking ruts with a rhythm that made conversation brief and thoughts long. Damp crept up from the floorboards, the horse's breath smoked, and the river smell arrived before the river itself, a mineral melancholy threading through the curtains as if to say, "Prepare." At the riverside, the foundling home leaned like a veteran bearing weather and years in its hinges, its bricks freckled by old soot and brine. Gulls wheeled and cried, thin knives of sound in the grey sky, and the Thames breathed in a slow, grey animal way that suggested a chest rising and falling, patient, unpersuaded by human arrangements. Children's laughter, if laughter it was carried across the yard thin as gull bones, brittle, precious, and Evangeline March stepped down before Julian could extend a hand, her skirt lifting clear of a puddle by inches, her glove finding a small boy's shoulder before she had finished taking in the facade. She knelt without ceremony to tie his ragged bootlace, and when the lace resisted, slick with mud, she simply pressed the knot firm and patted his calf, as if the gesture could be a promise even when string refused to obey. Julian looked away, not from distaste but from the tightness in his throat that felt like the first bars of a song he did not yet know how to play. His fingers touched, absurdly, the cracked watch through his waistcoat as if to remind himself of the hour he had given himself to remember. Mrs. Ellaby, the matron, met them in the entry with a countenance of brisk kindness and the look of someone who had learned to spend softness like coin without making it cheap. "You are the ones who will inspect us into a better winter," she said, not smiling, yet grateful, and led them through narrow halls, where paint peeled in thoughtful curls, and the air held that mingled scent of soap, starch, and damp wool that belongs to institutions of survival. A shelf held 3 books, faded spines, cracked leather, and Eva paused at them as if before a cathedral, one gloved finger resting on a title until her breath steadied. Julian saw the same shelf, and read the absence around it like a ledger note in red ink, reproach written in dust. He counted things: slates missing on the roof, a window that would not shut, the distance between kitchen and dormitory, and how many minutes cold could steal from a child in transit. Eva noticed other arithmetic, the quiet humiliations in small bodies. "He hides his bread," she whispered as they passed a bed where a heel of yesterday's loaf poked, shamed, from under a thin mattress. A girl's hem had been lengthened twice and still revealed her ankle. A boy's cough was a metronome for a winter not yet finished. Her voice made compassion sound like a series of practical instructions, and he heard it that way, surprisingly grateful for orders he could obey that did not come from a dead man's habits. In the classroom, chalk dust floated like tame weather. A small girl with hair the color of tarnished brass approached Julian with both hands cupped and offered a paper swallow folded from some old advertisement, its creases neat but uncertain, its beak slightly blunted by hope. His hand trembled when he took it, and he did not know whether the tremor began in muscle or mind. Something unlearned shifted behind his ribs, like a new tide turning under a bank of stone. He tucked the bird into his breast pocket near the watch, and for a pulsing second he imagined one might teach the other to move. On the quay afterward, wind dragged at Eva's hat ribbons, so they wrote impatient cursive in the air. The river licked at the steps in small rehearsals, and the sky thickened in that way, which meant rain would be promoted from rumor to governance. They spoke in the measured tone of people intent upon disagreeing without breaking what they were only just beginning to recognize might be useful. "Ends without means are wishes," he said, the old grammar of his house arranging his mouth. "And means without ends are machines," she returned, not harsh, only exact. "Do not file down need until it resembles neatness." He gestured toward gutters and ledgers, to routes for coal and milk, to economies that could be coaxed from waste. She pointed, with the same hand that had tied a lace, to mouths and habits, to the way fear made children hoard, and how only predictability could unbecome that fear. Rain began, first a scatter, then a pattern dimples stippling the river's surface like braille, the world briefly legible even to those who had not yet learned to read, and he produced his handkerchief in reflexive gallantry. She declined with a cool inclination of the head that left no wound, only a lesson. Water beaded on her lashes and did not fall, yet when he turned, stung foolishly by his own useless linen, he found her gaze not on his face but on the star of cracked glass at his waistcoat. She looked at the watch as if she could hear its unending silence better than he could, and for a moment, in the rain, between the river's slow breathing and the gull's thin cries, it sounded to both of them like a clock biding its time. Weeks passed, and what began as correspondence clipped to courtesy, "Dear Miss March, in response to your memorandum. Mr. Harrow, I acknowledge receipt," lengthened by degrees, the sentences unbuttoning just enough to admit weather and detail, children's names appearing like careful footnotes beside requests for coal and boots, marginal notes about a boy who would not sleep unless a book was left open on the chair, a girl whose cough softened when she was given warm milk at dusk. Figures marched between them, but around those figures walked small observations, as if the arithmetic were escorted by life itself, and their tones, once parched, began to carry a low music of mutual attention neither wished to name. Late one evening, after the ink on his reply had dried with a patient shine, "We will reduce night drafts by sealing the west windows. I have a man who can oblige without offending the plaster." Julian, and unbidden by any sensible motive, found his way to the music room, a place he had avoided as if it contained a mirror that showed him too young. The piano, a sober instrument under a film of dust fine as grief, received his hands with the indifferent generosity of old friends, and he let a waltz fall out of him in half-remembered spirals, a tune his mother had once teased from these very keys in afternoons, before smoke had taught him other lessons. The housekeeper, passing like an accustomed ghost, stopped and put a hand to her apron, as if to still her own surprise. "Master Julian," she said, and the name sounded like a remnant from a softer grammar. "It's been years." He nodded without turning, feeling the cracked watch a stone at his breast, the paper swallow from the schoolroom propped against a candlestick, as if it too were listening, and thought, with a jolt almost like comfort, "I am not finished after all." Across the city, by lamplight that made her small parlor glow like a lantern set before a shuttered street, Eva read his latest letter, the hand precise, The phrases modestly exact, and paused when she came to that line about the west windows. Her mouth, which had learned to hold resolve as if it were a coin that might be spent only once, relaxed into a smile that no one saw. At their next meeting, in a room that still smelled of old varnish and a recent raincoat, she brought a list written in a neat hand, each item a thread that, properly tied, would mend something larger than itself. He admired, with a start he concealed, the discipline braided into her softened tone, a steel he could not budge, braided with silk he did not wish to fray. "You do not win me by agreeing, Mr. Harrow," she said when he nodded at a proposal, as if consent were a charm. "Nor do I wish to win you, Miss March, only the argument," he returned, and was surprised by the modest heat in his own ears when a faint color rose to hers. He offered to procure blankets. She countered with books. They did not choose, but braided the two, and compromise grew between them like ivy through brick, tendril by tendril, patient, insistent, ornamental only because it was so effective. Outside, snow began in tired flakes, as if the sky had been convinced against its will. The steps wore a treachery of whiteness, and when she slipped, just enough to fear falling and resent the fear, his hand found her waist with a surety that exceeded his plans, steadied, then let go so quickly he doubted it had happened at all. She did not doubt. The firmness of his fingers remained like a lesson one keeps not in the mind but in the body. And as they parted under the falling weather, each carried away a small, impossible warmth, the sort that does not announce itself but alters the temperature of a room all the same. Months earlier, when mornings were the color of dirty pewter and breath fogged the panes as if the house itself was shivering, smoke had written its bitter alphabet across the sky. Julian stood in the street with his collar open and learned how fast a name could be burned into a ledger he would never close. 3 lives tallied not as numbers, but as absences that would not be balanced, and afterward the pocket watch at his waistcoat, his father's. His inheritance of punctuality and command fell from his palm in the confusion and struck the cobbles, the glass cracking into a small star that fixed the hands at 9:17, the hour he would not let himself forget. He did not have it mended. He let its hard, silenced face sit against his heart like a cold instruction. To remember, he told himself, and to obey, though he could not yet have said what obedience would require, only that penance must be carried. A weight hung upon the spine to make it straight. Eva kept a private winter of her own, a brother who had coughed himself thin at the docks years ago, lungs forced to drink what the river refused, the telegram, coming on a slow afternoon, when drizzle blurred the boundary between indoors and out. The words were so few they seemed indecent: regret, illness, deceased, and she sat at the small table with her sewing kit open, needle threaded for a hem that did not matter anymore, and marked the margins of her psalms with a blunt pencil line under "Teach us to number our days," not because she believed counting saved anyone, but because the act of drawing a line steadied the hand that could not steady the world. In alternating memories, their childhood rooms reveal the grammar that shaped their mouths, his with maps pinned like intentions and a set of miniature ledgers in which he practiced entering sums until the columns behaved, a small compass that always knew which way his father's office lay, hers with a thimble that had belonged to her mother and the cheap gilt edges of a Bible worn to brown at the corners, a chair by the window where she learned to read aloud to a brother whose silence had been patience, not consent. When the city thawed gutters vomiting up winter's secrets, snow melting into grey rivulets that pointed toward the river, like a compulsion they met again in a narrow corridor outside the committee room, damp shaking itself from coats and umbrellas like dogs. She noticed his watch, as she had before, but this time the question slipped out low, almost tender against her own caution. "Why do you bear a wound like jewelry?" His reply, too quick, defended a citadel that had not been attacked. Some weights improve posture. The coolness scraped the air, the bruise of it surfaced even as he spoke, and before the echo died he hated the sentence for its arrogance, for how it cost nothing to say and taxed everything it touched. She inclined her head, the lesson of a lifetime closing her features into dignity that could be misread as ease. When she went, the corridor felt longer. Alone, he stood with the paper swallow the child had given him, crisping softly in his pocket beside the cracked watch, and thought, "I dismissed kindness like a fool. I have taken a hand offered and made it a rule." And the thought sat heavy, like a teacher's palm pressing a boy's shoulder. Stay, consider, change. Alone, she walked into the thinning light and felt rain begin again, small, persistent, and told herself, not unkindly, pride looks like stone until it crumbles under rain, and wondered whether it was his pride she meant or her own, and whether, when stones do finally yield, they become mud that dirties or earth that grows. The watch at his breast kept its unending silence, a stopped star. The river, somewhere beyond the roofs, spoke in its patient syllables, and early spring, with its unspectacular courage, persisted in thawing what had frozen when fire taught its lesson too hard. Under chandeliers that hung like captive constellations and cast a tremulous honey over lacquered floors, the charity gala unfurled with the smooth gloss of orchestral varnish. Laughter floated in layers, a practiced brightness polished by gossip until it shone like a mask, and everywhere velvet elbows and jeweled throats moved in a choreography of wealth, pretending to be weather. Julian stood among it with his posture disciplined into inheritance, the cracked watch a familiar weight against his breastbone, 9:17, always, and the paper swallow a small, improbable fault line in his pocket. The room smelled of beeswax and expensive perfume, and he thought, as the violins leaned into a waltz he recognized like a scar, that he had learned every elegant step and almost none of the ground. Lady Beatrice Lark approached with her smile, tuned to the exact pitch of admiration that did not owe, her arm threading through his as one silk thread finds another. Their history glimmered in the corners of the room, dances, arrangements, the comfortable intelligence of two people who had understood convenience and called it charm. Across the sea of gleam and chatter, he saw Eva not looking at him, which was how she looked best at him, chin set. Pearl-grey gloves quiet on the curve of a glass, eyes traveling the room as if taking a census of what could be mended with will alone. A swallow's small curve stitched into her handkerchief flashed when she turned, a signal only if one knew the code. The host called for pledges with the lofty cheer of a man confident in his friends, and the room assembled a theatre's hush. Names were pronounced, amounts announced, the evening performing virtue the way a bird performs song. When it came to him, Julian felt the watch's cracked face press harder, as if time itself wished to be consulted, and his father's voice, "Do not blink in a negotiation," rose like smoke and dissolved. He said the words without flourish, redirecting his principal benefaction from the hospital, Beatrice favored to the riverside foundling home, naming it plain as bread in a room that preferred pastry. The applause that followed was polite, not warm, like rain tapping on gilt. Fans fluttered as if birds had been startled. Beatrice's smile sheathed itself around a blade, and her fingers tightened fractionally on his sleeve. "You are becoming sentimental," she murmured, beautiful as frost, and he answered with the silence of a man who had learned that some replies are only receipts. He inclined his head, unhooked her hand with courtesy, and let the moment stand without ornament. Eva came nearer, not near, and their words moved as if glass were everywhere. "It is the children's victory," she said, grave and exact. "It is your persistence," he returned, and both felt how language, when handled carefully, could hold something newly alive without breaking it. Outside, the night was a breath held too long, humid, oppressive, a storm coiled in the distance, like a creature deciding when to strike. He stepped into it and removed his gloves, skin grateful for unmediated air, thinking, with a steadiness that surprised him, let the weather come. In her carriage, the door shut on a world of lights and voices, Eva pressed the swallow handkerchief to her mouth to keep some unruly tenderness from saying more than was prudent, and whispered into the woven threads, "Do not be kind if it will hurt," knowing kindness could be a wound if offered like a jewel, knowing also that some pains arrive like remedies and do not announce themselves until after the fever breaks. Weeks passed, and rumor, that nocturnal moth, found every lamp of conversation and singed its powdery wings upon Eva's name. A column in a popular daily, written with the narrow wit of a man who confuses innuendo with insight, suggested she enjoyed undue influence with a certain air, and the words flew farther than truth ever did, lodging in drawing rooms like burrs. The committee murmured in courteous undertones that hurt more than shouts. Letters were shuffled, brows composed into concern that had the texture of accusation. On a grey noon, when chalk dust hung in Eva's schoolroom like a tender weather, a footman in Harrow livery placed Mrs. Harrow's calling card upon her desk as if setting frost on a sill. The lady followed the card, eyes winter-bright, manner tempered into politeness as into steel. "My son is generous, Miss March," she said, each syllable a measured thread, "but generosity must remain decent." Eva, whose dignity did not keep her warm but kept her whole, inclined her head and answered with a restraint that cost her, "Decency is safest, where children are fed and taught, madam," and afterward, when she was again alone among slates and the scuff marks of small boots, she let her fingers rest on the swallow, stitched into her handkerchief, as if on a pulse. Across town, Julian read the column and tasted iron, the old metallic tang of anger and shame mixing until it formed resolve. He felt his mother's influence harden his jaw. She meant the world tidied into propriety, but instead of presenting himself at her door, he turned his pen to the editor, composing a rebuttal whose sentences stepped with careful authority, each clause an oar, drawing the public river toward clarity. He did not stop there. At a subscriber's gathering choked with attentive faces, he permitted himself the rare hazard of a speech, abandoning the armor of charts and ascending, awkwardly at first, then sure, into praise that did not sound like flattery but like confession. He named Eva, a woman of prodigious honor, whose counsel corrects my own ignorance, a phrase that went through the rooms of the city like a bell, the reverberation altering conversations in salons and over scutched linen, rippling even through the committee's dry air. She came to him the next day, firm and pale, eyes trained not to plead. "You should not have mentioned my name," she said, refusing both gratitude and the shelter it implies. He held her gaze and replied with a gentleness more dangerous than any scorn. "Then I should not have allowed it maligned," and the quiet between them filled with unsaid things that nevertheless existed, bright as fish just beneath the surface. That night, the house too large for one man's sleep, he stood before his window and saw, in the reflective dark, his father's ghost where only his own tired face was, a figure made of expectation and smoke. The cracked watch lay against his heart like a stone in a river, and he felt time pressing around it, not moving, forcing him to move instead. He thought, not without fear, "I am learning to spend a different currency." In the morning, the newspaper printed his letter. Some detractors scoffed men who fear a correction as if it were an illness, while others, unexpected allies, nodded toward the foundling home with new respect. At the school, Eva's pupils, quick to read weather on grown-up faces, filled the slate with small chalk swallows, asymmetrical and brave. She smiled at their flocking and felt something like a cracked window, letting in a palmful of fresh air, a tremulous courage that did not erase the bruise but warmed it from within. The city, restless and judgmental and capable of kindness in odd corners, went on. The Thames kept its counsel, and somewhere under the din, the repaired future, not yet formed, tapped its foot in time with a watch that did not tick and a heart that did, asking both of them to listen. Rain began as a whisper against the tea-room windows, and by the second cup had found its conviction. Warnings rode in with the steam river up, banks uneasy, tides in a temper, and by evening the Thames had shouldered past its manners and sulked over the embankment, deliberate and greedy, sending thin scouts of water into alleys and low rooms until the foundling home felt the city's old river decide to enter, like an uninvited relation. Lanterns swung in doorways, boots thudded on wet steps. Eva arrived with blankets stacked to her chin and determination stacked higher. Skirts gathered in one hand, the swallow-stitched handkerchief tucked at her wrist already damp. Julian came a breath behind, with oilskin and rope, and the kind of readiness that has no name until it is needed, his cracked watch thumping against his ribs at its permanent hour, as if to mark that time could be drowned, and yet still dictate terms. Inside, water stood ankle-deep, cold as a reprimand, children's cries scattered like startled birds. Mrs. Ellaby, hair unpinned, cheeks flushed with purpose, looked up from her small republic of chaos and said, "I knew you'd come," with the intimate steadiness of a benediction, as if faith could manifest into two figures bearing light. They became a chain without ceremony, Eva at the foot of the stairs, lifting, soothing, counting, Julian midway with his arms a cradle and his coat dark with rain and little hands, Mrs. Ellaby above, receiving, naming each child as if the name itself were a rung. A boy, all knees and fear, flung his arms around Julian's neck with the tenacity of the newly rescued and whispered, "Don't drop me." And Julian heard his answer arrive from a place he had not, until then, and believed he possessed, never. And the word was not a vow to the child only, but to a self he had thought, ash. The house groaned. Somewhere a beam voiced its doubt. Water shivered over the threshold with a perverse elegance. Candles, lifted high, made small suns of their own that smelled of tallow and hope. Eva slipped on a slick of the ordinary mud, panic, the treachery of haste, and her body went light in that brief physics before the fall. Both his arms found her as if they had been trained by a future, catching her at the waist and the shoulders, so that for a hitch of time they were nothing but breath and warmth, and the ragged edge of fear, faces close enough that candle smoke and rain braided in their mouths. "Evangeline," he said in the dim corridor, her name an unheard-of intimacy set loose from the formal cage, and she heard her own heart count seconds, tick, tick, and tick, animating the stopped watch with borrowed courage, or perhaps animating something older, the human need to be held on purpose and not by accident. The work resumed because work must, and afterward, when children were nested in upstairs pallets and the river's anger had been coaxed into a sulk again, they stood by the hearth where damp logs had been persuaded into flame. Their clothes steamed like ghosts leaving, and laughter fell out of them in relieved pieces, inelegant and necessary, the sort of laughter that trusts the ground. His hand long-fingered, clever, guilty, turned palm up between them, not touching, only asking, a proposal not of marriage but of witness. On the mantel the lantern threw a shadow that looked, because they had made it so, like a swallow just at the ark before home. Her gaze rested there and then returned to him, and the silence spoke not hunger but covenant, not rush but resolve. They did not kiss. The room would have misunderstood. Instead, something older moved between them, solemn as a candle carried from one pair of hands to another without letting it go out. And the river, chastened for the moment, went on with its ancient persistence, already preparing, like the city itself, to tell another version of this night that would lack the precise truth of two people choosing a single, quiet vow. Morning found the river contrite and the streets salted with a thin crust of silt, the foundling home ringed by a border of mud that had dried in tear striations along the steps. Blankets steamed from window latches, and the children, quick to repurpose disaster, planted sticks in the muck as if it were a foreign beach they had claimed. But rumor did not recede with the water it fattened in parlors and print shops, grew plum-dark and sugary with malice. "Alone together at midnight," said the city, rolling the phrase upon its tongue until it tasted scandal rather than rescue. In the committee room that smelled of damp wool and paper, a clerk coughed and the chairman adjusted his spectacles into delicacy while suggesting that Miss March might consider a brief sabbatical whilst matters calm. A phrase that felt like the careful lift of a hem above a puddle and left, her standing in it alone. Eva inclined her head, dignity a garment too thin for weather, yet the only one that fit, and said nothing that would feed them. That afternoon the long room at Harrow House seemed to lengthen further, as Julian, spine straight as a measuring rod and voice controlled to a near whisper, committed his mistake. "Miss March, I could, if you permit, arrange a marriage of convenience," he said, and the words were starched, respectable, each button fastened, your work secured, your name insulated, any damage absorbed by my own. And though he looked at his boots as if they might produce better sentences, his eyes when they rose were not convenient at all. She listened as one measures fabric, calmly, exactly. Her answer arrived soft and irrefutable. "Do not offer me safety when what I require is respect." And she left him in a room that expanded at once into a kind of uninhabitable ballroom, his father's portrait watching like a ledger with a face. Alone, shame tapped its pen. He understood with the humiliating clarity of a man who has been handed a mirror that he had offered solution where apology belonged, architecture where sunlight was asked for. In the window he saw his reflection take on his father's mouth, willful and incorrect, and he could almost hear the watch against his breast, still stopped, pronounce the verdict of an hour that would not move until he did. Elsewhere, in a schoolroom smelling of chalk and soap, Lady Beatrice Lark arrived on a cushion of perfume and concern. Her smile wore kindness, like a veil so fine it hid nothing. "Men are best guided by velvet," she said, letting the word purr, "and scandal by neglect." Eva, who had been requisitioning courage by the ounce all morning, smiled in a manner that did not invite furniture to be moved. "I have neither velvet nor interest," she replied, and the older woman's eyes flickered with the recognition of a door politely closed. A week later, a grant, small but essential as a thumb on a page, withdrew with a brisk note that might as well have been a nail. Eva set about packing books the way some pray carefully, with both hands stacking readers and primers into precise towers, arranging sorrow into a shape she could carry from shelf to shelf. The pupils' chalk swallows looked down from the slate like a council of tiny judges. Missus Ellaby stood by with twine and a stubbornness that could outlast winter. Outside, the city performed its indifferent industry. Eva tied each parcel as if binding a wound, thinking not of withdrawal but of what must be written next, and far across town. Julian stared at the unaddressed envelopes on his desk and at the cracked watch glinting its silent hour. Learning, at last, that respect begins with a question and a listening, and that some proximities are priced in patience before they are paid in peace. Nights lengthened, and the house acquired the hush of a church after worship, the air still warm with the residue of prayer. Julian moved through rooms that remembered footsteps, pausing in the music room where the piano's lid reflected the lamp in a wavering oval, and his cracked watch sat upon the polished wood like a verdict a judge had written and left behind. Its silence a doctrine he had obeyed too long. He touched keys without sound, laying his fingers along the ivories as if to gauge the temperature of a life not yet resumed. And somewhere in the glass, his father's mouth arranged itself on his own face until he turned away to break the spell. The letter arrived at dusk, the post's knock discreet as good breeding. The seal was simple wax impressed with a swallow modest, but it read as a crest to him, and he broke it with a care that made him feel both foolish and correct. Her hand was legible and spare, the sentences bearing their burdens without complaint. A brother lost to a dock cough years ago, and the day the sky drizzled grief that would not lift. Bread hidden by children, as if a crust could be a secret that kept body and soul disguised. The courage that looks like ordinary tasks. We are made by what we attend to, Mr. Harrow, she wrote, and the line had the cleanliness of a seam pressed flat, offering no place to hide fray. She did not flatter or accuse. She arranged truth as she tied parcels, steady, practical, exact. And at the end, after figures carried in loaves and hours of warmth, she placed the sentence that undid him with its precise blade. You mistake atonement for transformation. He felt the words enter, find a chair in his chest, and sit down to wait, impatient as a schoolmistress who has decided a boy will learn his sums, even if the lesson requires all afternoon. The watch on the piano ticked nothing, as if proving her right. He wrote a reply of contrition and arithmetic, and tore it. He drafted an argument dressed as humility and tore that too. At last, on paper that seemed to look up at him asking for decency rather than style, he wrote the only sentence he trusted, teach me where to put my hands, meaning rope and coal and benches, meaning ledgers refigured to honor breath, meaning if he dared name it and would not yet her heart, not to own but to safeguard. He sealed it quickly, as if speed could prevent backsliding, and sent it into a city that devoured and delivered as it pleased. Days passed thin, exacting each evening, folding into the next, with the soundless consent of habit. On the 5th, when the lamps were being touched alight along the square, and rain began its mild tattoo on the slate, a small parcel arrived, unheralded, light as if it contained only permission. Inside lay his watch, mended, ticking with the immodest confidence of a thing that has been forgiven but not forgotten. There was no note, only rhythm. He held it to his ear and heard not judgment, but time resuming like a river released from a polite pond, heard in the little machinery the slope of rain on roof, and children singing off-key at morning exercises, bright and indelicate. True, he set the hands to the hour with a care that felt like prayer, and laid the watch against his pulse, where old fear and new purpose met and measured one another, and in the next room the piano gave a single sympathetic hum when he brushed its side, a swallowed chord, as if the house itself had decided quietly, irrevocably, to keep time with what he would become. As spring lifted its damp hem from the cobbles and the plane trees shook out a green no one could legislate, Julian called his board to order in the long room with the green baize table where so many sums had grown teeth. The mended watch ticked now at his breast, a small, insistent animal that could not be shushed, And when Ambrose Lindley cleared his throat with proprietorial thunder, and Mrs. Harrow's eyes went winter bright from the far end, he felt something inside him refuse to yield. "Gentlemen," he said, voice level, a man selected by his own conscience, "we will divest at once from the dirtiest contracts, the ones that blacken our lungs and our ledgers alike, and endow an independent school charter free of our name, so that instruction may not be mistaken for advertisement." Ambrose snarled about ruin and votes. "You would unmake profit to purchase applause, Harrow and Mrs." Harrow's silence cut cleaner than any protest. He heard, faint, his father's old maxim, "Do not blink in a negotiation," and he chose instead to breathe. "You may call it madness," he answered. "I will call it correction." The cost arrived with the efficiency he had once admired in profit. Partners peeled away like unhappy wallpaper, leaving paste-sour patches of absence. The newspapers muttered, "Madness," inked in columns that smiled while showing teeth. Even friends shook his hand with an interim in their eyes, as if standing in a draught, as if loyalty were a thing the weather could excuse. He did not rebut the city with speeches. He put on a plain coat and went down to the river, where a municipal fire bucket waited under the iron railing, and he fed old ledgers to a managed flame, the lists of quotas and hours and fines that had made him a tidy man, pages curling with a domesticated sigh. The smoke rose mild as a hymn, and he kept the watch in his other palm, feeling time and ash, converse. Word of severance reached Eva like a knock she did not yet open. She went to the shuttered mill where boards crossed the windows like arms folded against apology, and inside the dust hung in columns like drifting epilogues. He was there already, sleeves turned, not as penance but as posture. The air smelled of long work, emptied of its noise. "You need not be here," she said, wary because hope is an extravagance that must be purchased dear. "I need to be everywhere I have been wrong," he answered, and the quiet after was large. Then, not as parade but as inventory, he named the dead of the fire from years ago, each name placed with the care he had once only given to figures. His voice stayed steady while his hands betrayed their trembling. "They did not die for my profit," he said, and the sentence landed like a key set down where a map had said a door must be. She listened with her body, shoulders, spine, the remembered winter of a brother who had coughed himself thin, and the swallow of her breath lifted, paused, and came to perch nearer than either had expected, and not trust yet, but the promise of it. Outside, the river made its patient sound as if approving a smaller, cleaner fire, and the ticking at his breast kept time with a world that had begun, at last, to reline its pockets with decency. As autumn arrived with copper leaves skittering along the pavements like small determined letters, the school, displaced but not undone, hummed in a temporary hall that smelled of soap, ink, and damp wool. The benches stood in neat ranks like sober soldiers, and Julian, coat plain and sleeves darkened by honest work, carried those benches two at a time, hauled coal with a care he would once have reserved for ledgers, and went about learning names as if names were a new currency that could redeem old accounts. Molly, with the gap-toothed smile, who miscounted on purpose to keep his attention one number longer. Thomas, who hoarded chalk slivers as if they were eggs that might hatch. Elsie, who would only read if her hand rested on the hem of his sleeve, as if steadiness could be borrowed through cloth. Small moments, small as pins and as necessary, accumulated. He buttoned a child's coat with large fingers that had closed too often around profit, and now practiced gentleness. She corrected his Latin with a low, unembarrassed murmur, "Not esse but idere, Mr. Harrow, when one is speaking of bread," and he took the correction like bread itself. Their looks, once quick and armored, learned to rest. In an empty classroom between hours, dust turning in the angled light, and a swallow chalked days ago still haunting the slate's corner with its suggestion of escape, he found speech emptied of all the strategies that had preserved him. "I mistook money for medicine," he said, the mended watch ticking at his breast like a witness who required no oath. She studied him, not interrogating but measuring, knowing that hearts declare themselves most in the mathematics of tomorrow. "I forgive what I understand," she answered, voice steady, "and what I do not understand I will not hold against you, but remain different tomorrow, and then we will speak of love." Something inside him loosened, not for indulgence but for duty accepted. There are vows one can only make to the future. They walked home beneath plane trees that seemed to be shedding old arguments with their leaves. the dusk smelling faintly of apples and rain-born iron. His hand hovered near hers, like a sparrow deciding whether to trust a windowsill, and she let the back of her glove brush his knuckles, contact so brief it might have been invented by memory, yet the skin remembered. Rain began light, approving, and he stopped, drawing the watch from his pocket as if producing a treaty. "Hold my time, if you will," he said, absurd and sincere, offering up the small, mended circle that had once been a sentence and now asked to be a poem she could carry. She slipped it into her pocket, the chain disappearing into wool with a whisper that sounded to him like reprieve, and they went on with their speaking and their silences, both changed, their dialogue less armored, more musical short phrases, longer breaths until quiet grew companionable, not accusatory. At her doorstep, the light from within threw a courteous square upon the wet step. He bowed as if before a sovereign who had not only conquered him, but made conquest irrelevant, and when she smiled, it was with the grave tenderness of one bestowing an invisible laurel, not to applaud an ending, but to consecrate a beginning. The weather itself seemed to bless. Part 13. The city woke to a new weather made of whispers and ink, brittle as frost along the railings. Lady Beatrice, elegant as frost herself, cool and exact, set a petition upon certain piano lids and club tables, a document that spoke in silken syllables of improprieties and misallocation, and signatures bloomed upon it like mildew in a damp room, spreading where light was thin and pride plentiful. By week's end, the council had fixed a hearing, notices pasted straight as commandments on municipal boards, and Ambrose Lindley went about with the satisfied air of a man who has pressed a thumb into wet cement. Yet at night, reflected in the dark gloss of his shaving mirror, he looked private, uneasy, cheeks hollowed by the knowledge that he had wedged himself on the wrong side of a changing story. Eva felt the petition's chill in the marrow of her work. At 3 in the morning she stood by the window of her little room, the mended watch warm in her palm, ticking like a small, stubborn heart she had been entrusted to carry, and she whispered to it as to a creature capable of obedience, "Hold," while the city answered in low foghorns from the river, as if some great animal turned in sleep. Julian, for his part, gathered what the truth required. Affidavits from mothers who took off their boots at the door as if entering a church, testimonies from dockmen whose names he now knew without consulting lists, the children's copybooks tied with twine, still smudged with their efforts, letters sturdy as little benches. He wrote late into lamplight, not a polemic but a beam, preparing a speech that would be less a weapon than a lighthouse, a steady turning of illumination toward shoals he had once called home. Beatrice came to him in daylight, dark as polished wood, fur at her throat like a tame winter. In the privacy of his study she offered, without rancor and with a remembered smile, a return to comfort, patrons pliable, newspapers tamed, the old waltz resumed where it had faltered. He bowed to what they had been, without misnaming what they were. "You taught me how to dance, Beatrice," he said, gratitude edged in iron. "She taught me how to walk." Her eyes for a moment showed the wound of accuracy, then she inclined her head, an empress granting withdrawal. Gossip rose to fever, became its own orchestra, violins of insinuation, drums of certainty. Mrs. Harrow, hearing the city's music too clearly, closed her door to Ava with the finality of a ledger snapped shut. It was not a quarrel, it was a climate. Days narrowed toward their appointed spectacle. Children recommitted their swallows to the slate, as if to rehearse the shape of persistence. The night before the hearing, rain threaded itself through the gaslight like fine needlework, and Eva and Julian sat at a small table with plain tea. No declarations poured, only steam. Their hands lay near each other on the wood, two provinces, negotiating a border without emissaries, while in her pocket the watch kept its courteous measure, and outside the river, which had watched empires and errors, kept moving, as if to remind them that history could, if asked and answered properly, be made to change its mind. Part 14. The council chamber smelled of damp coats and ink, a weather made of human breath and municipal paper, and citizens filled the benches with eyes eager for spectacle and ears that wanted, if coaxed properly, to be converted. Along the front table, Ambrose Lindley arranged his notes with the relish of a barrister who believes a rehearsed sword will still draw blood, and when he stood he spoke of irregularities as if they were moral lapses in the stitching of a nation's hem, his voice oiled, precise, pointing to columns and signatures, to whispers elevated to paragraphs, while at the edge of his vision, Lady Beatrice watched with a poise that looked unquestionable at a dance, and less certain under gaslight and rain-streaked windows. Eva rose first, plain and exact, the mended watch's weight a small, steady tide in her pocket, and her speech unrolled like a seamstress, laying out a pattern upon a table. She spoke of figures in loaves and not merely pounds, in boots mended and not merely ordered, in hours of warmth bought with coal and not merely in the fictive comfort of winter promises. "Here is a week of milk," she said, "and here 24 copybooks for hands that tremble less when they are trusted, and here a ledger that counts nights without fever." And she moved the room not by charm but by clarity, the way a garment pleases when it fits without pinching. When Julian stood, there was a ripple anticipation, suspicion, the city's memory of his name, and he offered first a thin blade of truth, almost nothing. "I have been wrong," he said, letting the words lie without cushion. Then the longer cadences lifted, a modest chapel discovering its organ as he let his voice make a careful, unembarrassed music. "I ask you to believe in what patience can build. Not the patience of waiting with folded hands, but the patience of showing up with benches and bread, of learning names, of learning where the draft comes in and how to seal it. I have mistaken endowment for absolution. I do not ask for your forgiveness, but for the school's continuance." He named his former failings without excuse, as if reciting a lesson he had at last understood belonged not to the tongue but to the doing hand. He spoke the fire's date, as one says, a psalm, and he let silence do its part, which it did. The room thinned to a held breath, and outside the rain, which had sulked at first upon the panes, brightened into a cleaner drizzle, as if the weather, too, listened and preferred this version. A child unprompted, untrained in decorum's leash, stood on a bench like a small trumpet and declared, "Sir reads us stories." And the laughter that ran through the chamber was not unkind, even Ambrose's mouth unsure whether to condemn or be human. Beatrice's gaze flickered, not quite admiration, not quite retreat, as if a window in her private winter had cracked a degree. The council consulted in a huddle that looked like a cluster of ravens come to a common conclusion. When the chair rose and announced the charter granted, the applause hesitated, testing its own propriety, then gathered as a body finds a rhythm, hands speaking where tongues could not. And Eva's eyes, so often disciplined to brightness rationed, shone outright, a light like a clean seam in good cloth, while Julian, shoulders lowering as if divested of a year's worth of invisible weights, exhaled the long breath he had been holding since he first heard her voice in a fogged room. And beyond the high windows, the drizzle loosened into something almost delicate, the courtyard roses shaking their wet heads as if to beckon whoever had won the right to go outside and speak softly among them. They strayed, as if by instinct seeking a quieter air in which to let the day's verdict settle, into the back garden where the rain had left roses bowed under the weight of their own perfume, each bloom a soft fist unclenching, and the city's noise drays and arguments, triumphs rehearsing themselves, already in parlours thinned to a distant sea-combing pebbles. Gravel complained politely beneath their steps, a small sound in a world that felt suddenly attentive, and they stopped near a bench green with a film of moss, not sitting, as if to sit might concede too much to comfort too soon. The breath between them was warm with effort and rain, his coat still damp at the seams, her gloves a shade darker where the drizzle had insisted, and for a moment they practiced the old caution, the old diplomacy of hands that do not reach, of eyes that look at the roses in order not to look at the person who has become a rose's rival. And then Julian, as if hearing some inner gavel call him to a jurisdiction beyond committees, let the words come as quietly as he knew how, which turned out to be very quiet indeed, as if not to startle the bird his courage had become. "I love you not for forgiving me, but for demanding I become a man worthy of the forgiveness I seek." The sentence, once in the air, acquired weather and gravity. She felt it land on her breastbone like a lark settling, and in that place where she had learned to store both indignation and mercy, she found, to her own surprise, something lighter than either. "I love you," she answered, and her voice was smaller and truer, without embroidery, for noticing the bread hidden in little hands and doing something about it. And then she laughed soft, astonished by the ease of the phrase, as if relief itself had a sound and had chosen hers. And under that laughter he felt his old life step back a pace to let the new one enter with its parcels of duty and its quiet pleasures. They moved toward each other without theatre, not as combatants finally conquered, but as diplomats agreeing not on terms but on a country. When they kissed, it was not a trumpet but a vow, not conquest but covenant, and the world did not flare. It deepened, edges softening into meanings they had not known how to read until now. The mended watch, in her pocket, ticked as if to provide a witness's affidavit credible, unshowy, and when he set his forehead against hers, he listened with a reverence that startled him to the ordinary miracle of rhythm, of time that, once cracked, had joined again, admitting a seam you could trace with a fingertip and admire rather than hide. "Tomorrow," she said, because love that is to endure prefers the plain word that faces weather. "Tomorrow," he answered, not in gallantry but in comprehension, because he had learned that time can be coached into kindness if a person keeps his hands steady. The roses exhaled. Somewhere a gate clicked. Above them, a swallow cut the damp air, a quick black syllable stitched across the grey, and they watched it grow small until it was no longer a bird, but a thought moving in the mind's sky, promising departures and returns, promising, like the watch, that what is held carefully will continue. News travelled to Mrs. Harrow's drawing room like a draught one cannot quite locate. Discreet, undeniable, altering the temperature without rattling the curtains, and when Julian stood before her amid the pale upholstery and portraits that watched with the fixed calm of the already decided, she received it with an austere sorrow that set even the tea service to seeming colder. "Your father built a world for you not to need this," she said, and in the pronoun this lay all that she meant: a woman who worked, a wife who would not lounge in safety, a son who declined to be obedient to the architecture money erected. He could have braced. Instead he steadied, as if the new self he had been practicing had found its spine. "He built a world I must rebuild," he answered, and the gentleness in it was not capitulation but craft, a hand learning to plane wood along the grain, and when he kissed her cheek, he tasted the salt of a thaw, not yet a spring but no longer winter. Her fingers, which had been a composition of rings and restraint, softened around the saucer, and she said, "Not blessing but not curse. Then do not squander your courage in flamboyance," which he heard as permission to be ordinary and steadfast. That afternoon Lady Beatrice Lark called once more, not to tempt, but to conclude, and Eva met her at the school's doorway that was heavy with unsaid things, the smell of chalk and boiled starch. Children's laughter rolled thin as ribbon somewhere behind her, the street sun striking dust into coins, and for a time they stood, two women who had once been adjacent to the same man in different dialects of knowing. Eva offered her hand, a simple shape in space, and Beatrice, whose hesitation was always elegant, took it at last. "I will not be your friend," she said, the honesty like a clean seam, "but I will not be your enemy." And a strange mercy hummed between their palms, as if a wire had been strung there to carry something useful later when alarms might ring. The city, which had been watching as cities do, pretending not to, seemed to approve. Sun slanted through soot, as if making a vow to attempt beauty anyway. A costermonger tipped his cap without quite knowing why, and a cluster of children uncoached, most politics beyond them, cheered the way only children can, with the pure accuracy of hearts that read tone better than letters. Plans unfurled not with trumpets but with string and paper. A modest wedding, invitations few and precise, intentions many. Mrs. Ellaby offered a corner of the home's courtyard for garlands that would later be paper swallows cut by small hands. A neighbour with a good coat, but no taste for crowds, promised chairs. Julian counted coins and time with the same care he had once given to margins, though now the arithmetic felt like prayer. Eva measured fabric for a dress that would not hinder the afternoon's reading. Love, here, declined spectacle, and became utility made radiant. Lists that were also tenderness, errands that were vows, a visit to a printer that felt like a blessing. At evening, when the light took on that late exhausted gold of a city that has worked and intends to again tomorrow, Eva sat at her narrow desk, the mended watch breathing a patient metronome beside an ink bottle, and opened the journal in which she had for years written to a brother who could not read her any longer. She told him, as she always did, the plain facts: this child's cough gone, that copybook full, Mrs. Harrow's eyes thawing by degrees, and then she paused, feeling the delicate theft of fear that still crept like a draught under the well-closed doors of happiness, and wrote, steadily to steady herself, "I have found a man who would mend his watch to keep time with us." And as the sentence settled into the page's fibers, she laid her palm over it and listened to the ticking like an oath that time, if held rightly, and would not betray them. Sabotage arrived the way a bad habit returns uninvited, unashamed, pretending to be accident by way of a tin oil lamp in the storeroom, tipped at an angle that no ordinary clumsiness would have chosen. The smell of paraffin thickened first, then smoke uncoiled itself along the ceiling, testing beams and corners as if remembering old roots, and when the first finger of flame licked a crate of copy paper, it wrote its swift, orange alphabet with hideous fluency. The alarm came as a handbell clanged by Mrs. Ellaby with such force the metals sang, and then voices gathered into purpose. 2 by 2, Eva called, her steadiness sheathed over fear like a velvet scabbard. Hands held hats can be lost, no child shall. And small palms found small palms, a file of coats and anxious eyes, of knees scuffed and courage practiced, pouring toward the yard while Julian's voice lower, commanding without steel counted and recounted until numbers aligned with names. He smelt the heat, shifting from warning to intent. The old lesson rose in his chest like a ghost with wet hands and said, "Do not go back into it." And he answered it with the obstinacy of the newly remade, "I refuse your prophecy," and plunged into the sour brightness, a sleeve over his mouth, the watch at his breast a rapid, absurd heartbeat. He took what mattered, the iron box of records heavy with names that had learned, by sheer ink, to be important. A stack of children's copybooks, soft with fingers and pride, a slate on which yesterday's sums still glimmered faintly, proof that a calmer logic existed. He caught the edge of a cough that could have been his own childhood and pressed forward through it. Eva, skirt hem dark with water from a sloshed bucket, vanished in another direction. The medical box, she threw over her shoulder, and he wanted to drag her back by the syllables and yet did not, could not, for he had learned to trust the terrors she named necessary. She returned with bandages and a tin of salve, hair loosened from its pins, eyes bright as catastrophe, and together they made their own small lane toward air. In the yard there was already a line. Beatrice Lark had arrived with 2 footmen and a coachman carrying their household's buckets as if they were silver. Her dress, the wrong sort for this, but her stance precise as command, and neighbors, aprons, caps, a butcher with blood under the nails he had scrubbed as he ran, fell in beside, past and future, shouldering the work in a rhythm older than animosity. "Faster," Beatrice said without grandeur, and again, and water beat at the school's hot breath until that breath stuttered, and then at last relented. A figure was glimpsed at the alley mouth, a narrow coat, a hat tugged low, a pace that meant to be ordinary, and, by meaning to be, betrayed itself, and then the city swallowed him as cities do, its alleys acting as throats. The fire died the way a bully does, with a final protest and a puddle of shame. Inside, smoke drew its handwriting across the walls, a script in char that had something of malediction and, if you looked longer, of instruction. Eva's hands shook when she reached for the bell to silence it. Julian's arm found her waist with a certainty his brain could not yet afford. Soot smeared her cheek like war paint. "No more fires," he murmured, the statement a vow and a plea, the old blaze deep in him answering with a remembered roar that he declined to hear. "Only hearths," she answered, and because she said it, he could imagine it heat corralled into usefulness, danger domesticated into warmth, light made to read by. Children coughed and then hiccup laughed in the thin, triumphant way of the nearly frightened. Mrs. Ellaby blessed everyone and no one in particular. Beatrice, hair damp and order restored to her face by effort, nodded to Eva once, a compact made of salt and smoke, and left with no declaration at all. Morning showed the wreck more honestly, a storeroom bitten but not devoured, a ceiling browned like old bread, black streaks down plaster like writing on a wall that wanted a name. They read it together, side by side under a sky washed to clarity by the night's exertions, and decided it said, not ruin, but resolve. "We rebuild," Eva said, touching the char as if reading Braille, and brighter, and his watch, which had not betrayed him, ticked in agreement, obedient as a metronome set to a future. He thought of paper swallows cut by small hands, of hearths, of ledgers that recorded not profit but patience, and knew the city had offered them an alphabet ash and water, and that they would spell with it what they required. Summer ripened as if the city had remembered how to sweeten after so much smoke, and the schoolyard, still marked with the char script of warning, turned into a workshop of mending. Neighbors arrived with bricks wrapped in newspaper and loaves under aprons, with hammers that had seen roofs through winters and songs that fit easily into the cadence of labor. A costermonger set his cart as a table for nails. Mrs. Ellaby counted blessings while counting boards, and children, stern with purpose, cut white swallows from cheap paper until the floor was a snowfall of scraps that did not chill. What had been a building became a community, and in that conversion something quiet and stubborn took root that felt like the first proof of their old vow. Only hearths. They married there, in the Foundling Home's courtyard, beneath a garland of those paper swallows, stringing one low wall to another, like a thought steadied between two truths. The sun struck tin pails into brief halos, boots were polished as best as poverty teaches, and Julian, clean-shaven with a care that betrayed nerves, stood beside Eva, who had chosen a dress that made room for breath and movement, and the passing of a book from one small hand to another. Their vow was simple and exacting as a list written neat for morning. I will keep warm what you bring into my arms. I will turn fear into bread when I can, into silence when I must. And when they said, tomorrow, it sounded like continuity rather than deferment. Mrs. Harrow attended with a spine like an heirloom, her gloves immaculate, her expression careful as a ledger at year's end. Stiff at the first hymn, she softened by the second, and when Eva came near, she whispered, as if confessing an old superstition to be wrong, "You look braver than happiness," which might, in another house, have been a benediction. Beatrice did not come, but a parcel arrived ribboned in restraint, books stamped tastefully, and a card in her hand, for the library you insisted into existence, which Eva read twice and then placed for others to see, so that gratitude might circulate without becoming debt. Their first dance refused velvet floors and chandeliers. It was a ring of children, hands linked, knees too enthusiastic, a circle tugging them into the center until the two of them laughed, because there is a humility to joy when it is shared. He laughed unpracticed, surprised to hear himself without restraint, and she glowed as if she had always known that merriment could be managed like a classroom, tenderly. At dusk the city gentled into lavender, and he opened a small box with the formality of apology done right, a locket, modest, inside a picture of the Foundling Home, its crooked roofline dearer than symmetry, and a sprig of dried heather from the riverside, where wind once dragged at her hat, ribbons. "To keep near what we serve and where we began," he said, and she touched the heather as if it still smelled of rain. Later, after crumbs had been brushed away and chairs stacked by boys who looked proud of their usefulness, they sat with their shoulders touching in a room that would be theirs, speaking in the soft arithmetic that had become their dialect sums of blankets needed before. Michaelmas. The cost of lamp oil balanced against the price of primers, the distribution of bedtime stories so no child would be missed. Romance, here, was a shared ledger of kindnesses, entries checked by two hands. When, at last, Eva lifted the repaired watch from her pocket, the very one he once asked her to hold. "Hold my time, if you will, and set it upon the mantel above a grate that promised only warmth now." Its ticking did not sound like sentence or penance. It measured not guilt but days, not debt but promises kept in small coin, and its modest music, tick, tick, made a poem in the air. They would breathe together. Years passed. As spring returned, the school thrummed with 1,000 small treads, chalk dust floating in shafts of light like tame weather, trained to behave over slates and heads, and the corridor smelled of soap, pencils chewed to thought, and wet wool hung to steam. A little boy with harrow-dark hair and March-bright eyes ran the length of it with a grin that threatened to be disallowed and never was, his boots knocking out a rhythm that made the day keep time. Eva laughed from the doorway, that laugh that seemed to turn a lesson into a story. While Julian looked up from a chair, he was mending fingers ink-smudged by a morning of lists and nicked by sincere carpentry, and felt astonished the way a man feels who has stumbled at last into the ordinary happiness he had once argued was impractical. Happiness, he discovered, did not shout. It tapped along panels with small feet. It asked for another page. It needed 3 more nails and someone to hold the other side steady, and it had a face that could be traced in charcoal and remembered. The city had altered by inches, as cities do. Some mills wore their cleanliness like a new uniform. Some chimneys were quieter. The river smelled less of impatience and even ambition. That quick horse wore a human face now and then and did not trample small gardens for sport. Near the school door, a modest bronze plaque caught morning as if it had been designed to bless. It commemorated the day of the hearing, names pressed into metal like promises cooled to permanence, and the children, forefingers reverent, traced the letters while their mouths practiced the shapes, learning history as they learned handwriting, discovering that language could be both a weapon and a blanket. He watched her across a sunlit garden, not across a crowded soirée, but through air filled with bees and the hush of leaves, her skirt lifted above damp grass, her hand resting on a pupil's round shoulder, her mouth softened by the habit of encouragement. Desire now did not burn him to ash. It held, it circled, it deepened, like the way roots decide upon a stone, and wrap it until stone and root belong to one ground. The swallows returned to the eaves with a competence that made them seem like old neighbors, and their nest in the corner of brickwork brightened with oddities, straw, string, and a narrow scrap of ribbon, the exact pearl grey of the gloves she had worn that first evening when fog pressed itself to London's panes. Their son saw it first, face lifted, finger stabbing joy upward. "Look, Mama!" And she, shading her eyes, felt the queer, hopeful doubleness of time. What had been armor now softened into shelter. That evening rain set about its service with a softness that sounded like approval, pattering the garden just enough to rinse dust from leaves, and they sat by the hearth, where only hearths belonged, a saucepan murmuring milk to cocoa, the repaired watch ticking on the mantel in a patience he had learned to treasure. On the boy's small wrist, fixed with ribbon because wrists were stubborn things, a second, smaller watch his father had contrived for him peeped its lighter measure. Together they made an odd duet, 2 modest hearts at different scales, keeping an agreement between generations, and Julian, with his son's head against his thigh, and Eva's hand threaded with his, where the fire showed their bones as ephemeral as they truly were, thought, "We did not end the world's cold, but we made this room warm." Eva slipped the locket to her palm and held the heather until its memory of rain rose. Outside, a swallow wrote a patient curve over the roof and vanished into the eaves' dark syllable, and inside the ticking gathered domestic sentences into a paragraph that said, over and over and over, "We rebuilt, we keep, we keep, we keep." The resolution did not arrive with trumpets, but with bread cooling on a sill, with benches carried and set in straight lines, with the school's rooms echoing not with calamity but with recitations and small laughter. The foundling home widened a little at its seams to take in more beds, more books, more names, and the marriage, true to its early promise, grew like ivy over sound stone, patient and green, warming brick by mere persistence. When disputes came, as they do, as weather does, they were met with soft, stubborn labor. A walk taken in the drizzle rather than a word sharpened to a blade, an apology placed like a cup of tea on a table whose wobble was already known, a ledger balanced not only in pounds but in kindnesses traded back and forth until evening, asked only for the lamp to be trimmed. The swallow still nested in the eaves, industrious as ever, and the repaired watch on the mantel ticked with the unapologetic modesty of a heart that had learned enough of sorrow not to flaunt its continuance. Some nights, when the city breathed its long coal sigh, and the boy's lighter watch added its chatter to the room, Eva and Julian would listen and recognize in that duet an answer to the fog and glass and trembling crystal of their beginning, not thunder but rhythm, not spectacle but held time. Dear listener, there is a courage that does not glitter. It looks like carrying the other end of the bench without being asked, like mending a watch not to display it but to be reminded to arrive, like apologizing without theatrics and meaning the diminuendo more than the speech. It looks like staying when staying requires the daily refitting of one's pride. Consider how love is rarely the lightning that splits a night, and more often the lamp tended through weathers foul and fair, wick trimmed, glass wiped, flame protected by a hand that has known cold. Consider, too, that rivalry, when pride is frightened and does not yet know its own better shape, can be the first silhouette of recognition, a circumference one walks until one finds the door. We are each asked, in our own rooms and mornings, in our ledgers and kitchens and mirror-lit corridors, whether guilt will be a monument set high and admired for its misery, or a doorway cut into a wall, we thought load-bearing. Choose the doorway if you can, and step through gently, letting what was once heavy become the hinge. If rumor severs you, let your work speak like rain on slate, steady, cleansing, uninterested in opinions. If someone offers you safety that costs you respect, keep your hands for your making and your heart for your choosing, as she did at a price and he learned to honor. May your days be stitched with small mercies, and your nights keep company with a clock that ticks in time with a kinder future. Take your time, then take another's hand, and in the shared cadence find that rooms warm faster when kept together. If this tale kept you company, carry it forward, build, mend, forgive, and be forgiven. Come again, and let us share more warmth and words by the hearth we make together.